Welcome back to The Sleepy Scientist, where we drift through time, not just space, one gentle thought at a time. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. We're not reaching for distant galaxies or quantum fields. We're reaching backward, into the dust of empires, into scrolls and clay tablets, into the forgotten corridors of ancient commerce. We're going to decode something strange, something that echoes across millennia like a persistent dream you can't quite remember. We're looking at forgotten financial codes, the hidden patterns of ancient economic bubbles, and maybe, just maybe, by the time you drift off, you'll see that the rise and fall of fortunes, the dance of greed and ruin, hasn't changed all that much in 3,000 years. Before we begin this journey through time and money, through marble counting houses and Silk Road caravans, do me a small favour. If you enjoy falling asleep to these explorations, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And tell me in the comments, where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Are you in a quiet room in Oslo at 2 a.m? In a sun-drenched apartment in Sydney at noon? Knowing you're out there, scattered across the globe, listening to the same ancient whispers, it makes this whole thing feel a bit like time travel itself. And here's the thing about tonight's topic. You might find yourself staying awake longer than usual. Money, bubbles, crashes, these aren't exactly lullaby material, but I promise, we're going to take it slow. We're going to wander through these ancient marketplaces with no rush, no urgency, just curiosity and wonder. If you fall asleep halfway through, that's perfect. That's the whole point. Consider this your permission slip to drift off whenever you need to. The ancient world will still be there in the morning, patient as ever. Let's begin. Imagine, if you will, that you're standing in a bustling marketplace, not a modern one with credit cards and stock tickers, but an ancient one, let's say Rome, around the 1st century. The air smells of olive oil and sweat, of fresh bread and horse manure. Merchants shout in Latin, in Greek, in languages you don't recognize. Money changes hands, but it's not paper money. It's metal, heavy and real. Gold aureus, silver denarii, bronze sestertii. You can feel the weight of commerce in your palm. Now here's what's strange. If you could understand what these merchants are talking about, really understand it, you'd hear something eerily familiar. You'd hear speculation. You'd hear debt. You'd hear the same mixture of hope and fear that drives markets today. You'd hear whispers of certain investments, guaranteed returns, opportunities that won't last. You'd hear, in other words, the beginnings of a bubble. We tend to think of financial bubbles as modern inventions. Tulip mania in 17th century Holland, the South Sea bubble in 18th century England, the dot-com boom of the late 90s. We imagine that ancient people, lacking our sophisticated markets and instruments, couldn't possibly have experienced the same speculative frenzies, the same catastrophic collapses. But that's where we'd be wrong, dead wrong, because human nature, that complicated, beautiful, foolish thing, hasn't changed much at all. The term bubble itself is relatively modern, coined after the South Sea bubble of 1720. But the phenomenon, the pattern of irrational exuberance followed by devastating collapse, that's as old as commerce itself, as old as the moment humans first decided that some objects were worth more than others, that value could be stored, transferred, manipulated. Think about it this way. What is money really? It's a shared hallucination, a collective agreement that certain things, pieces of metal, scraps of paper, digital numbers on a screen, represent value. And what is a bubble? It's when that hallucination intensifies, when the shared belief in value detaches from any underlying reality, when we convince ourselves that something is worth far more than it could ever actually be. Ancient peoples understood this, perhaps better than we do. They didn't have economic textbooks or Federal Reserve policies, but they lived with the consequences of economic forces every single day. They felt the weight of debt, the thrill of profit, the terror of collapse. And they left us clues, scattered across the ruins of their civilizations, about what they learned. Let's talk about Rome for a moment. Not the Rome of gladiators and emperors, though they're in the background. The Rome of bankers and landlords, of debt and speculation. Because Rome, at its height, was an economic superpower. It controlled trade routes from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria. Wealth poured into the city like water into a basin, and where there's wealth, there's always someone trying to get more of it. In the late Republic and early Empire, land was everything. If you owned land, you owned power. You could rent it out, farm it, build on it. Land was the ultimate store of value, the ancient equivalent of real estate investment trusts, and so, naturally, people speculated on it. Wealthy Romans would buy up vast estates, not to farm them, but to hold them, to wait for the price to rise. They'd borrow money to buy more land, confident that the value would keep climbing. It's a bit like the housing bubbles we've seen in our own time, isn't it? The assumption that prices only go up, that you can't lose, that the future is guaranteed to be more prosperous than the present. But here's the thing about assumptions. They tend to shatter at the worst possible moment. The Roman land bubble, such as it was, didn't burst in a single dramatic crash. It was more of a slow deflation, punctuated by crises. Wars disrupted trade routes. Plagues devastated populations. Political instability made property rights uncertain. And suddenly, all that land, all those estates that seemed so valuable, weren't worth as much anymore. Debt that had seemed manageable became crushing. Families that had been wealthy for generations found themselves ruined. It wasn't as dramatic as a stock market crash. No ticker tape, no panicked selling. But the pain was just as real. Let me tell you about Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Roman history. He made his fortune in part through real estate speculation, but not the kind you might think. Crassus maintained a private fire brigade. When a building caught fire in Rome, which happened frequently in those cramped wooden structures, Crassus would show up with his fire brigade. But he wouldn't put out the fire, not yet. First, he'd negotiate with the property owner. He'd offer to buy the burning building at a fraction of its value. If the owner agreed, Crassus would extinguish the fire and add another property to his portfolio. If the owner refused, well, the building would burn to the ground. It's a shocking story, almost grotesque in its calculation. But it illustrates something important about ancient economies. They were personal, immediate, often brutal. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission, no consumer protections, no regulations preventing predatory practices. The strong took from the weak. The clever exploited the desperate. It was capitalism in its rawest, most Darwinian form. And yet, even in this cutthroat environment, patterns emerged. Rules, not written in law, but encoded in the behaviour of markets themselves. Crassus got rich, yes, but he also died spectacularly, killed in battle against the Parthians, his severed head used as a prop in a theatrical performance. The wheel of fortune turned for him just as it does for everyone. Now let's think about what was happening with Roman currency during this same period. The Romans used coins made of precious metals, gold and silver mostly, with bronze for smaller denominations. The value of these coins came from the metal itself. A gold aureus was worth its weight in gold, more or less. But here's where it gets interesting. The Roman government discovered something that governments have been discovering ever since. You can debase your currency. You can reduce the amount of precious metal in each coin, mix in cheaper metals, and use the difference to fund your government. In the short term, it works. You have more money to spend on armies, public works, circuses. But in the long term, people notice. Merchants start demanding more coins for the same goods. Inflation creeps in. Trust erodes. The Romans debased their currency repeatedly over the centuries. During the crisis of the 3rd century, silver content in Roman coins dropped from nearly pure to less than 5%. The result was predictable: hyperinflation, economic chaos. People stopped trusting the currency and reverted to barter or demanded payment in goods rather than coins. The sophisticated monetary system that had held the empire together for centuries began to crumble. It's the same pattern we saw in the Song Dynasty, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's the same pattern we've seen in Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela. Governments facing fiscal pressure debase their currency, inflation follows, trust collapses, and the economy seizes up. The technology changes, but the code remains the same. Let me paint you another picture. You're in ancient Rome again, but this time you're not in the marketplace. You're in a banking house. Yes, ancient Rome had banks. They were called argentari, silver dealers. These bankers would accept deposits, make loans, exchange currency. They kept meticulous records on wax tablets. They charged interest, sometimes quite high interest. They were, in many ways, not so different from modern banks. Now, here's where the Roman financial system gets really interesting. Rich Romans would often borrow money not because they needed it, but because it was profitable to do so. Interest rates on loans were lower than the returns they could get from investing in trade expeditions, land deals, or even lending to others at higher rates. So they'd borrow at, say, 6% annual interest and invest at 10 or 12%. The difference was pure profit. Sound familiar? It's called arbitrage. It's leverage. It's the same basic principle that drives modern finance. Borrow cheap, invest in something that returns more, pocket the difference, and it works beautifully, right up until it doesn't. Because here's the problem with leverage. It amplifies everything. When times are good, when your investments pay off, you get rich faster than you would with just your own money. But when times are bad, when your investments fail, you don't just lose your profit. You lose everything, including money you borrowed, and if you can't pay it back, well, in ancient Rome that could mean slavery, prison, or death. The Roman financial system experienced several major credit crunches. One of the most famous happened in 33 AD during the reign of Tiberius. A complex series of events involving changes to usury laws, a crackdown on illegal money lending, and general economic uncertainty led to a sudden crisis of liquidity. Basically, everyone wanted their money back at the same time, and there wasn't enough money to go around. Debtors couldn't pay creditors. Creditors couldn't pay their creditors. Asset prices collapsed as people desperately sold property to raise cash. It was a full-blown financial panic, indistinguishable in its mechanics from the panic of 1907 or the credit crisis of 2008. The Emperor Tiberius eventually had to intervene, making a massive loan from the imperial treasury to stabilize the banking system. It's eerily similar to modern central bank interventions, isn't it? When the financial system seizes up, the government steps in to provide liquidity, to restore confidence, to prevent total collapse. The Romans learned something from this crisis, though the lesson didn't stick for long. They learned that financial systems are fragile, that confidence once lost is hard to restore, that interconnectedness, while it allows for growth and efficiency, also means that problems can spread rapidly. One person's debt is another person's asset. When debts go bad, the losses ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in water. Let's drift now across deserts and mountains to ancient China. Different culture, different language, different everything. But the pattern, the code if you will, starts to repeat itself. China has a long, incredibly sophisticated economic history. Paper money, as I mentioned earlier, was invented in China during the Tang Dynasty, around the 9th century. But it really took off during the Song Dynasty, a few centuries later. The Song Dynasty was a golden age for China. Population boomed, cities grew, trade flourished, art and science advanced, and underpinning all of this was an increasingly complex economy. The Song government issued paper money called jiaozi, originally as promissory notes for merchants who didn't want to carry heavy copper coins on long journeys. It was convenient, efficient, brilliant. But then, as so often happens, the government realized it could print more notes than it had metal to back them. At first, this seemed harmless. More money in circulation meant more economic activity, more trade, more prosperity. But slowly, inexorably, prices started to rise. What cost 1 jiaozi yesterday cost 2 today, then 3, then 5. The Song Dynasty experienced several episodes of serious inflation, particularly during the southern Song period when they were fighting expensive wars against northern invaders. The government needed money for armies, for fortifications, for tribute payments, and the easiest way to get it was to print more currency. But every time they did, they eroded the value of existing currency. Savers were wiped out. People on fixed incomes, like retired officials or widows living on pensions, saw their purchasing power vanish. The social consequences were severe. Unrest grew. Trust in government declined. The economy, despite all the paper money sloshing around, actually contracted because people lost faith in the medium of exchange. Merchants demanded payment in silver or goods. The sophisticated monetary system regressed. Now I want to take a little detour here and talk about something that connected Rome and China, something that created one of history's greatest economic networks, the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, of course. It was a network of trade routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean, connecting dozens of civilizations, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, religions, and diseases. And critically for our purposes, it was also a conduit for precious metals, the basis of ancient currency. Silver mined in Central Asia would flow east to China, where it was highly valued. Silk produced in China would flow west to Rome, where it was worth its weight in gold. Literally. Roman elites paid astronomical prices for Chinese silk. The trade imbalance was so severe that Roman writers complained about precious metals draining out of the empire to pay for luxury goods. This created interesting economic dynamics. China accumulated silver, which supported their monetary system. Rome lost silver, which contributed to their currency problems. The economies of these distant empires, which had never directly contacted each other, were nevertheless linked by trade, by the flow of goods and money along those dusty caravan routes. And here's where it gets really interesting. When political instability disrupted the Silk Road, when wars or plagues made trade dangerous or impossible, both economies suffered. Markets that had become dependent on distant trade suddenly found themselves cut off. Prices spiked for certain goods. Industries that relied on imported materials collapsed. It's not so different from modern supply chain disruptions, is it? We've become so interconnected, so dependent on global trade, that problems halfway across the world can empty shelves in our local stores. The ancient world understood globalization, at least in its embryonic form. They understood that economies don't exist in isolation, that what happens in one place ripples outward, that we're all connected by invisible threads of commerce and exchange. Let me tell you about one particular commodity that flowed along the Silk Road and created something very much like a speculative bubble: spices. In ancient Rome, spices from India and Southeast Asia were incredibly valuable. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves. These weren't just flavoring agents. They were status symbols, wealth itself. A pound of pepper could cost as much as a labourer's monthly wages. Wealthy Romans would serve spiced dishes at banquets to show off their wealth and sophistication. Now, spice trading was risky. Ships could sink. Caravans could be raided. Entire expeditions might disappear without a trace. But the potential profits were enormous. A successful spice voyage could multiply your investment tenfold, 20-fold. And so, naturally, people speculated on it. Investors would pool their money to finance spice expeditions, a practice that was basically an early form of venture capital. If the expedition succeeded, everyone got rich. If it failed, well, you lost your investment. It was high risk, high reward. And because the potential returns were so large, people convinced themselves that it was worth the gamble. Fortunes were made and lost on spice trade. Families rose from obscurity to prominence on a single successful voyage. Others, wealthy for generations, were ruined when their ships didn't return. It was a form of economic volatility that would feel familiar to anyone who's invested in cryptocurrency or early-stage tech startups. The parallel is striking, isn't it? Whether it's spices in ancient Rome or tech stocks in modern America, the pattern is the same. High potential returns attract speculators. Prices rise beyond any reasonable valuation. People convince themselves that this time is different, that the fundamentals support the prices, and then, inevitably, reality intrudes. Ships sink, startups fail, prices crash, and everyone wonders how they could have been so foolish. Let's go even further back to ancient Mesopotamia, to Babylon and and Akkad, to civilizations so old that they were ancient to the ancient Romans. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was one of humanity's first agricultural civilizations, and agriculture brings with it a particular economic dynamic. Farmers need to borrow seed in the spring and pay it back after harvest. They need to borrow during lean years and repay during abundant ones. Credit, in other words, is essential to agricultural societies. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated credit systems thousands of years before Rome even existed. Merchants would make loans to farmers, to traders, to craftsmen. Interest was charged, typically around 20% per year. Contracts were written in cuneiform on clay tablets, specifying the amount borrowed, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, and the penalties for default. These clay tablets still exist. Archaeologists have found thousands of them, and reading them is like peering into an ancient financial system that's both alien and surprisingly familiar. Here's a farmer borrowing barley seed, agreeing to repay with interest after harvest. Here's a merchant financing a trading expedition, with the loan secured against the goods being traded. Here's a craftsman taking a loan to buy raw materials, promising to repay with finished products. But the Mesopotamians also understood something important about debt. They understood that it could become unsustainable, that if debts grew too large, if too many people were enslaved to creditors, the entire social fabric could tear apart. And so, periodically, Mesopotamian kings would declare what's called a debt jubilee. All debts would be forgiven, all debt slaves would be freed, the slate would be wiped clean, and the economy could start fresh. It sounds radical, almost socialist, but it was actually conservative in the sense of conserving the social order, because when debt burdens become too heavy, revolution becomes likely. Better to forgive the debts than to face social collapse. The most famous example of this is the Code of Hammurabi, though it's often misunderstood. Most people know it for the eye for an eye principle, but much of the code deals with economic matters, interest rates, debt contracts, property rights, commercial disputes. It was, among other things, an attempt to regulate the economy, to prevent the kind of debt spirals that could destabilize society. Think about that for a moment. 4,000 years ago, in a world we often think of as primitive, they understood that debt needed to be managed, that interest rates needed to be regulated, that sometimes, for the good of everyone, debts needed to be forgiven. It's a lesson that modern societies still struggle with. We saw it during the 2008 financial crisis. Should mortgage debts be forgiven? Should student loans be cancelled? The arguments echo across millennia. Now let me tell you about another ancient economic innovation that's both fascinating and a little terrifying. Debt slavery. In most ancient societies, if you couldn't repay your debts, you could be enslaved. Not forever, necessarily. In some systems, debt slavery was temporary, lasting until the debt was worked off. In others, it was permanent. But the principle was the same. Your labour, your body, your freedom became collateral for your debt. From a purely economic perspective, this makes a certain cold logic. If someone lends you money and you can't pay it back, the lender needs some way to recover their loss. In modern societies, we have bankruptcy courts, asset seizures, credit ratings. In ancient societies, they had slavery. But of course, this created terrible incentives and terrible outcomes. Unscrupulous lenders could trap borrowers in unpayable debts. Families could be torn apart. Children could be born into slavery because of debts incurred by their parents. It was a system that turned human suffering into an economic asset. And yet, disturbingly, we can see echoes of this in modern times. Not literal slavery, of course, but debt that can't be discharged in bankruptcy, like student loans in the United States. Debt that traps people in cycles of poverty, where they're working just to service interest payments. Payday loans with predatory interest rates. Prison systems that charge inmates for their own incarceration, creating debt that follows them after release. The mechanisms are different, more subtle, more bureaucratic. But the pattern, the code, is similar. Debt as a form of control, a way to extract labour and obedience from the desperate. Let's talk now about something that connected all these ancient economies, something so fundamental that we barely even notice it anymore: coinage itself. Before coins, trade was conducted through barter, or through the exchange of commodities with agreed-upon value. Barley in Mesopotamia, cattle in pastoral societies, shells or beads in various cultures. These commodity monies work, but they're inefficient. You need to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have, and you need to physically transfer the commodity, which can be difficult if you're trading in cattle or barley. Coins solved this problem. They're portable, durable, divisible, and fungible. A silver coin from Athens was worth the same as any other silver coin from Athens. You didn't need to inspect each one individually like you would with cattle or grain. The government stamp guaranteed the weight and purity, at least in theory. The first coins appeared in Lydia, in what's now Turkey, around 600 BC. They were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. Within a few decades, coinage spread throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. It revolutionized trade, allowed for more complex economies, enabled specialization and division of labor. But coinage also introduced new problems, counterfeiting for one. If a coin's value comes from the government's stamp rather than just the metal content, then people have an incentive to make fake coins, to stamp cheaper metals with official-looking marks. Ancient governments responded with harsh penalties for counterfeiters, including execution. But counterfeiting persisted. Debasement, as we've discussed, was another problem. Governments themselves would reduce the precious metal content of coins, essentially counterfeiting their own currency. This worked in the short term but eroded trust over time, and then there's the problem of money supply itself. In a commodity money system, the money supply is limited by the available quantity of the commodity. You can't have more gold coins than you have gold. This prevents certain types of inflation, but it also means the money supply can't grow to match economic growth. If your economy's growing but your money supply isn't, you get deflation. Prices fall, which sounds good but actually discourages spending and investment. Why buy today when it'll be cheaper tomorrow? Why invest in a business when the money you'll earn in the future will be worth more than the money you're spending now? The Romans, particularly during the late Republic and early Empire, managed to thread this needle fairly well. They mined new gold and silver as their economy expanded, keeping the money supply roughly in line with economic growth. But it was a delicate balance, and it couldn't last forever. Eventually, the easily accessible mines were exhausted. The flow of precious metals from conquest slowed, and the money supply became constrained, contributing to the economic troubles of the later empire. It's a problem that wouldn't be fully solved until the advent of fiat currency, money that derives its value from government decree rather than from any physical commodity. But fiat currency brings its own problems, as the Song Dynasty discovered. Without the constraint of a physical commodity, governments can print unlimited amounts of money, and history shows that they often do, with predictable results. There's no perfect monetary system, it turns out. Commodity money constrains the money supply, which prevents some types of inflation but can cause deflation and restricts economic growth. Fiat money allows for flexible money supply, which can accommodate economic growth and prevent deflation, but it also allows for unlimited inflation if governments lack discipline. Every system has trade-offs. Every solution creates new problems. Now let's talk about the psychology behind all of this, because that's really what connects these ancient events to our modern world. Technology changes, institutions evolve, but human psychology, that messy, wonderful, predictable thing, it stays remarkably constant. There's something called recency bias. It's the tendency to believe that recent trends will continue indefinitely. If housing prices have been rising for 5 years, we assume they'll keep rising. If a particular investment has paid off, we assume it always will. The Romans who bought land during the Pax Romana probably thought peace and prosperity would last forever. The Song Dynasty citizens who trusted paper money probably couldn't imagine the government would devalue it. But nothing lasts forever. Trends reverse. Bubbles pop. It's as predictable as seasons changing, yet we always seem surprised when it happens. Then there's herd behavior. We're social creatures. We look to others for cues about how to behave. If everyone else is buying tulips or tech stocks or Roman farmland, we don't want to be left out. We don't want to be the fool who missed the opportunity. But here's the cruel irony. By the time everyone is doing something, it's often too late. The bubble is already at its peak, ready to burst. The smart money, as they say, has already moved on. There's a beautiful, tragic example of this from ancient history. During the reign of Nero, there was a fashion craze among wealthy Romans for a particular type of table made from citrus wood. These tables, called mensa citrea, came from North Africa and had beautiful swirling grain patterns. They became status symbols. Owning one meant you had arrived, that you were part of the elite. Prices for these tables climbed to absurd levels. Ancient sources record tables selling for the equivalent of a large estate. And because they were so expensive, they became even more desirable. If something costs that much, the thinking goes, it must be valuable. It's the same logic that drives modern luxury goods, from designer handbags to rare art. But here's the thing. These tables weren't actually that useful. They looked nice, sure, but they didn't function any better than tables made from cheaper wood. Their value was almost entirely social, based on signalling wealth and taste to others. And when fashions changed, when the next status symbol came along, those incredibly expensive tables became just tables. Their market value collapsed. The wealthy Romans who had invested fortunes in them found themselves holding assets worth a fraction of what they paid. It's a pattern we see over and over. Beanie Babies, pet rocks, cryptocurrency, some would argue, NFTs, objects whose value is primarily social, based on collective belief rather than intrinsic utility, are prone to spectacular bubbles. Because when the collective belief shifts, when the herd moves on to the next thing, value evaporates like morning dew. And let's not forget, overconfidence. Humans are really, really bad at estimating risk. We overestimate our knowledge, our control, our ability to predict the future. We think we're different, that we've learned from past mistakes, that this time is different, but it almost never is. The patterns repeat with clockwork precision. The ancient Greeks had a word for this, hubris, excessive pride or self-confidence. And in Greek tragedy, hubris always leads to nemesis, to downfall. The gods punish those who think they're cleverer than everyone else, who think they can escape the common fate of mortals. That's not just mythology, it's psychology. The most spectacular failures in financial history are often preceded by extreme confidence. I figured out the system, people think. I see what others don't see. I'm going to get rich. And sometimes they do for a while. But often, that confidence is precisely what leads them to take excessive risks, to ignore warning signs, to hold on too long as the bubble deflates. These psychological quirks, these cognitive biases, they're embedded in our brains. Evolution shaped us for small tribal societies, not for complex financial markets. And so we make the same mistakes century after century, millennium after millennium. Let's drift now to the aftermath of these ancient crashes, because that's where some of the most important lessons hide. When the Roman land market deflated, when debts couldn't be repaid, what happened? Well, power concentrated. The wealthy who had cash, who hadn't overextended themselves, they bought up distressed assets for pennies on the denarius. Small farmers lost their land and became tenant farmers or moved to cities. Inequality widened. Social mobility froze. The very fabric of Roman society changed, became more rigid, more stratified. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Financial crises tend to worsen inequality. The wealthy, who have cash reserves and can weather the storm, buy assets at fire sale prices. The middle class, often heavily indebted, gets wiped out. The poor, who never had much to begin with, suffer from unemployment and social instability. Some historians argue that these economic disruptions contributed to the eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. As inequality widened, As the middle class declined, as trust in institutions eroded, the empire became more fragile, less able to respond to external threats. Stability gave way to fragility, and when the barbarians came knocking, the empire couldn't hold. In Song China, the inflation crisis had similar effects. It eroded the middle class, the merchants and artisans who were the backbone of the economy. It made the government seem incompetent, untrustworthy. And when the Mongols invaded, when Kublai Khan came with his armies, the Song Dynasty couldn't mount an effective defense. Economic instability had weakened the state from within. Do you see the pattern? Financial crises don't just hurt people's wallets, they reshape societies. They determine who has power, who has opportunity, who survives and who doesn't. They're not abstract, not just numbers on a balance sheet. They're human tragedies, played out across generations. But here's the thing, and this is important, so let it sink in as you settle deeper into your pillow. These crises also contain the seeds of renewal. After the crash comes the rebuilding. New ideas emerge. Old systems that didn't work get swept away. Innovation happens in the ruins. After the Roman economic troubles, new forms of organization emerged. Feudalism, for all its faults, provided stability in a chaotic world. After the Song Dynasty fell, the Mongol Yuan dynasty brought new trade connections, new cultural exchanges. The Silk Road flourished. Ideas and goods flowed across Eurasia in unprecedented ways. Destruction and creation, they're two sides of the same coin. The forgotten financial codes tell us this over and over. Bubbles burst, but new bubbles form. Empires fall, but new ones rise. The wheel turns and turns and turns. Let me tell you about one particular example of post-crisis renewal. After the crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under the weight of civil wars, invasions, plague and economic chaos, a series of reformer emperors emerged. Diocletian and Constantine primarily. They restructured the empire, reformed the currency, reorganized the military, established new systems of administration and taxation. The empire that emerged was different from what came before. More bureaucratic, more authoritarian, more explicitly Christian. But it was also more stable, at least for a while. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, would last another 1,000 years until 1453. Not bad for a civilization that seemed on the brink of extinction in the 3rd century. The lesson here is resilience. Human societies are remarkably good at adapting, at learning from crises, at rebuilding. Yes, crises cause suffering. Yes, they reshape societies in ways that aren't always fair or just. But they also force innovation, force us to question assumptions, force us to try new approaches. The same is true on an individual level. Financial setbacks, losses, even bankruptcies, they don't have to be permanent. Many of the most successful business people have bankruptcy in their past. They learned from failure, adapted, tried again. The wheel turns. So what are these codes exactly? What are the universal principles we can extract from all this ancient history? First, there's the code of scarcity and abundance. When something valuable becomes abundant, whether it's land or silver or paper money, its value tends to fall. This seems obvious, but we forget it constantly. We assume that what's valuable today will be valuable tomorrow, but value is relative, contextual, fleeting. Gold has been valuable throughout human history because it's scarce, durable, and beautiful. But if someone invented a machine that could create unlimited gold, its value would plummet overnight. Its value isn't intrinsic to the metal itself. It comes from scarcity, from the shared belief that it's rare and therefore precious. The same principle applies to assets. If everyone is buying real estate, if everyone is investing in a particular sector, that very popularity can erode future returns. Because when everyone is buying, who's left to buy from you when you want to sell? Second, there's the code of debt and leverage. Debt allows growth, allows investment, allows people to do things they couldn't do with cash alone. Rome couldn't have built its empire without borrowing. Medieval merchants couldn't have financed their trading voyages. Modern corporations couldn't build factories and infrastructure. But debt is also a chain. It binds the future to the past. It amplifies both gains and losses. When things go well, leverage multiplies your returns. When things go badly, it multiplies your losses and can destroy you entirely. Every ancient civilization that collapsed under debt teaches us the same lesson. Borrow carefully, know your limits. Remember that what goes up can come down, and most importantly, distinguish between productive debt and consumptive debt. Productive debt is borrowing to invest in something that will generate returns. A farmer borrowing seed to plant crops, a merchant borrowing to finance a trading expedition, a modern person taking a mortgage to buy a house, or a student loan to get an education. These debts, if managed well, can improve your position. Consumptive debt is borrowing to fund current consumption. Credit card debt to buy things you want but can't afford. Payday loans to make it to the next paycheck. This kind of debt makes you poorer, not richer. It's a trap that's very hard to escape. The ancients understood this distinction, even if they didn't use these terms. The Mesopotamian merchant borrowing silver to buy goods for trade was using productive debt. The Roman aristocrat borrowing to fund lavish banquets was using consumptive debt. One path leads to prosperity, the other leads to ruin. Third, there's the code of trust and collapse. Economic systems run on trust. Trust that money will hold its value, that contracts will be honoured, that governments will maintain stability. When trust erodes, everything unravels frighteningly fast. The Romans trusted in land. They believed it would always hold value, always generate income. When that trust proved misplaced, when land values fell and rents dried up, the economy contracted. The Song Chinese trusted in paper money. They believed the government would manage it responsibly. When that trust was betrayed by excessive printing, the economy spiraled into chaos. Trust is the foundation of all commerce, all finance, all economic activity, and it's remarkably fragile. It takes years to build and moments to destroy. Once lost, it's incredibly difficult to restore. Think about bank runs. Why do they happen? Not because the bank has actually run out of money, necessarily, but because people lose trust that the bank has their money. And when everyone tries to withdraw at once, that loss of trust becomes self-fulfilling. The bank actually does run out of money. The same dynamic applies at larger scales. Currency crises happen when people lose trust in a currency. Stock market crashes happen when people lose trust that prices are sustainable. Financial system collapses happen when people lose trust in the institutions that hold the system together. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, there's the code of human nature. We are greedy and fearful, optimistic and pessimistic, rational and irrational, all at once. We create systems, markets, economies, and then we break them with our own psychological quirks. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and we'll probably keep doing it for thousands more. Because evolution shaped us for a very different world than the one we now inhabit. We evolved to seek immediate rewards, to value the concrete over the abstract, to follow the herd for safety. These instincts served us well in small tribal societies. They serve us poorly in complex financial markets. But here's the beautiful, frustrating thing. We can't escape our nature. We can't rewire our brains to be perfectly rational economic actors. What we can do is become aware of our biases, recognize when they're leading us astray, and develop systems and habits that compensate for them. The ancient world didn't have behavioral economics or cognitive psychology, but the wisest among them understood intuitively that human nature was both the engine of prosperity and the seed of destruction. Let me tell you about another ancient civilization that experienced something very much like a financial bubble: ancient Egypt. Most people think of Egypt as eternally stable, unchanging, a civilization that lasted 3,000 years without major upheavals. But that's not quite accurate. Egypt experienced periods of chaos, collapse, and renewal, just like everywhere else, and economics played a role in several of these disruptions. During the New Kingdom period, roughly 1500 to 1000 BC, Egypt was immensely wealthy. Gold flowed from Nubian mines, trade flourished, pharaohs built massive temples and monuments, the economy hummed along, generating surpluses that were stored in temple granaries and treasuries. But then something interesting happened. The priesthood became incredibly wealthy and powerful. Temples owned vast estates, employed huge numbers of workers, controlled enormous stockpiles of grain and precious metals. In some ways, they functioned like banks, making loans, storing deposits, facilitating commerce. At the peak of temple power, the Temple of Amun at Karnak owned more land than the pharaoh himself. Think about that. A religious institution controlled more wealth than the state. It's a bit like if the Catholic Church owned more assets than the government of Italy. This concentration of wealth in temple hands created economic distortions. Resources that might have been invested productively were instead dedicated to building ever more elaborate temples and supporting ever larger priesthoods. The economy became unbalanced, too dependent on religious institutions. When Egypt's empire contracted, when tribute from conquered territories dried up, when trade routes were disrupted, the economy couldn't adapt. The temples had soaked up too much wealth. The pharaohs, desperate for resources, eventually had to confiscate temple property, which caused social and political chaos. It's a cautionary tale about concentration of wealth, about what happens when too much economic power accumulates in too few hands. Whether it's Egyptian temples or Roman senators or medieval monasteries or modern billionaires, the pattern is similar. Extreme concentration of wealth distorts economies, creates inefficiencies, breeds instability. Now let's talk about another fascinating economic system from the ancient world, the Athenian silver mines at Laurion. Athens, in the 5th century BC, became the wealthiest and most powerful city-state in Greece, and the foundation of that wealth was silver. The mines at Laurion produced enormous quantities of it, which Athens minted into coins, which funded the navy, which secured trade routes, which brought more wealth to Athens. It was a virtuous cycle, at least for a while. But the interesting thing is how the mines were operated. They weren't owned by the state directly. Instead, the state leased mining rights to private entrepreneurs. These entrepreneurs would pay for the lease, hire slaves to work the mines, and keep the profits. It was an early form of privatization, of public-private partnership, and it worked remarkably well, generating enormous revenue for both the state and the mine operators. Athens became rich, built the Parthenon, funded the arts and philosophy, created the cultural golden age we still admire today. But there was a dark underside. The mines were worked by slaves under brutal conditions. Mortality rates were appalling. It was in many ways a civilization built on suffering, on the extraction of wealth through the expenditure of human lives, and it wasn't sustainable. The richest veins eventually played out. The flow of silver slowed, and when Athens lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta, when the empire contracted, the economic foundation crumbled. The silver that had funded Athenian glory dried up, and with it went the city's power and prosperity. There's a lesson here about resource-dependent economies. Whether it's ancient Athens relying on silver or modern nations relying on oil, building your economy on a finite resource is inherently risky. Resources deplete, prices fluctuate. What seems like inexhaustible wealth can vanish surprisingly quickly. Modern economists call this the resource curse. Countries with abundant natural resources often end up poorer and more corrupt than countries without them, because the easy wealth from resources discourages investment in education, infrastructure, diversified industries, and when the resource runs out or prices collapse, the economy has nothing to fall back on. Athens eventually recovered, of course. The city survived, though it never regained its former glory. Life went on, people adapted, the wheel turned. But the Golden Age, the time when Athens seemed to be the center of the world, that was over. Let me take you now to Phoenicia, to the great trading cities of Tyre and Sidon and Carthage. The Phoenicians were the merchants of the ancient world, the traders, the middlemen who connected civilizations. They developed sophisticated commercial practices. Double-entry bookkeeping or something like it. Insurance for trading voyages, where multiple merchants would pool risk. Standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade. Even something resembling corporations, where multiple investors would pool capital for large ventures. The Phoenicians understood risk in a way few ancient peoples did. They knew that any single trading voyage might fail. Ships could sink, cargoes could be lost, markets could collapse. But if you spread your investments across multiple voyages, multiple goods, multiple routes, the losses would be offset by gains. It's portfolio theory, 2,500 years before modern finance formally articulated it. And it worked. The Phoenician cities became fabulously wealthy. They established colonies throughout the Mediterranean, from North Africa to Spain to Sicily. They traded in everything: timber from Lebanon, purple dye from murex snails, metals from Spain, grain from Egypt, wine from Greece. They were the connectors, the facilitators, taking a profit from every transaction. But here's the interesting thing. The Phoenicians never built an empire in the traditional sense. They didn't conquer territory and extract tribute. Instead, they built a trading network, a web of commercial relationships held together by mutual profit. This made them resilient in some ways. When one city fell, others continued. When one trade route was disrupted, they found alternatives. The network was distributed, not centralized. But it also made them vulnerable. They depended on trade, on the free flow of goods and people. When larger empires rose, when Rome eventually conquered the Mediterranean, the Phoenician trading network was subsumed into a larger imperial economy. The cities survived, but their independence, their commercial dominance, that was gone. It's a pattern we can see in modern globalization. Small trading nations, Singapore or the Netherlands or Hong Kong, can become wealthy by facilitating global commerce. But they're also vulnerable to disruptions, to changes in the global order, to larger powers that can reshape the rules. The Phoenicians left us another legacy too: the alphabet, the system of writing we're using right now, the letters that make up this script. They're descended from the Phoenician alphabet. It was a commercial innovation, a way to keep records, to facilitate trade across language barriers, and it ended up being one of humanity's most important technologies. The foundation for literacy, for literature, for the transmission of knowledge across generations. Sometimes economic innovations have spillover effects far beyond their original purpose. The Phoenicians just wanted an efficient way to track shipments and debts. They ended up creating a tool that would reshape human civilization. Let's drift back to Rome for a moment and talk about something that's both fascinating and horrifying: bread and circuses. The phrase comes from the Roman poet Juvenal, who criticized the Roman populace for caring only about panem et circens, bread and circuses, free food and entertainment. The implication was that the people had become passive, willing to trade political freedom for material comfort and distraction. But there's an economic story behind this too. Rome, at its height, had a population of over 1 million people. Most of them didn't farm. Most didn't produce their own food. They depended on a complex supply chain that brought grain from Egypt and North Africa, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul. The Roman government subsidized grain for citizens, eventually giving it away for free. It was a massive expense, a huge logistical challenge. Entire fleets of ships dedicated to hauling grain across the Mediterranean. Government granaries storing enormous stockpiles, a bureaucracy to manage distribution. Why did they do it? Partly for political reasons, to keep the urban population docile, but also for economic reasons. Rome needed urban workers, craftsmen, soldiers, administrators, and those people needed to eat. If food prices spiked, if people couldn't afford to eat, the city would have exploded in riots. So the government stabilized food prices through subsidies and direct distribution. It's an early form of social welfare, of government intervention in markets to ensure stability. And it worked. For centuries. Rome avoided food riots and starvation, despite having a huge urban population dependent on imported grain. But it created dependencies. Egypt became the breadbasket of Rome, critical to the empire's survival. If grain shipments were disrupted, Rome faced crisis, and when the Western Empire eventually fell, when the trade networks collapsed, cities couldn't sustain their populations. Urban populations crashed. People moved back to rural areas. Civilization, in a sense, regressed. The lesson here is about resilience versus efficiency. The Roman grain system was efficient. It fed millions of people using complex logistics and global trade. But it wasn't resilient. It depended on specific trade routes remaining open, on political stability in Egypt, on naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. When those conditions changed, the system collapsed catastrophically. Modern supply chains face the same tension. Just-in-time manufacturing is efficient but not resilient. Global trade is profitable but vulnerable to disruptions. Specialization increases productivity but creates dependencies. There are trade-offs, always trade-offs. Now let me tell you about one of the strangest economic events in ancient history. The crisis of the ancient world's gold supply in the 4th century BC. For centuries, gold had been relatively common in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Persian hoards, accumulated by generations of conquest, contained vast quantities of it. But gold was mostly stored in treasuries, not circulating in the economy. It was wealth, certainly, but inactive wealth. Then Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, and suddenly all that stored gold flooded into circulation. Alexander paid his soldiers, funded new cities, invested in massive construction projects. Tons of gold, thousands of years of accumulated treasure, entered the economy in the span of a decade. The result was predictable to modern economists: inflation. The value of gold dropped because there was so much of it. Prices rose. People who'd been wealthy, who had savings in gold, found their wealth diminished. It was a shock to the economic system, a sudden increase in money supply that took decades to fully absorb. But it also stimulated economic activity. All that gold circulating meant more trade, more investment, more construction. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander was one of great economic expansion, of scientific and cultural flourishing. The economic stimulus from all that Persian gold helped fuel a golden age. It's a perfect example of a complex economic phenomenon. The same event, the influx of gold, had both negative effects, inflation eroding wealth, and positive effects, stimulus spurring growth. Whether it was good or bad depends on who you were and how you were positioned. If you were a debtor, the inflation was great. Your debts became easier to repay with cheaper money. If you were a creditor, it was terrible. The money repaid to you was worth less than what you'd lent. If you were a merchant or craftsman, the increased economic activity probably benefited you. If you were living on a fixed income, the inflation hurt. Economics is rarely simple. The same forces that benefit some harm others. There are winners and losers in every change, every shock, every bubble and crash. Let's talk now about an ancient empire that most people overlook, the Mauryan Empire in India, particularly during the reign of Chandragupta Maurya and his grandson Ashoka around 300 BC. The Mauryans built a vast, sophisticated state. They had a huge standing army, an extensive bureaucracy, and most interestingly for our purposes, a detailed economic system codified in a text called the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra is remarkable. It's a manual for statecraft, covering everything from espionage to taxation to market regulation. And it shows that the Mauryans understood economics in surprisingly modern ways. They had progressive taxation, where the wealthy paid higher rates than the poor. They had regulations against monopolies and price fixing. They had government inspectors ensuring fair weights and measures in markets. They had managed trade, with tariffs and export controls designed to benefit the state. The Arthashastra even discusses monetary policy, inflation, and interest rates. It recommends government intervention in markets to prevent shortages and stabilize prices. It's sophisticated economic thinking, articulated 1500 years before Adam Smith. But the Mauryan Empire also shows the limits of central planning. The government tried to control too much, to regulate every aspect of economic life. The bureaucracy became bloated and corrupt. The tax burden grew oppressive. And when central authority weakened, when emperors proved less capable, the system collapsed surprisingly quickly. It's a lesson that applies to modern economies too. Government regulation can prevent market failures, can protect consumers and workers, can provide stability. But too much regulation stifles innovation, creates inefficiency, breeds corruption. Finding the right balance is one of the eternal challenges of economics. The Mauryan Empire is also famous for Ashoka, one of history's most interesting rulers. After a particularly bloody conquest, Ashoka converted to Buddhism and renounced violence. He erected pillars throughout his empire inscribed with edicts promoting ethics, compassion, tolerance. But Ashoka also continued to maintain the economic system that funded his empire. The taxes still had to be collected, trade still had to be regulated, the army still had to be paid. He found a way to balance spiritual values with practical governance. It's a tension that has never been fully resolved. How do you build an ethical economy? How do you create prosperity without exploitation? How do you balance material wealth with spiritual or moral values? Different civilizations have answered these questions differently, but none have found a perfect solution. Let me tell you now about one of the most sophisticated financial instruments in the ancient world, the bottomry loan. This was a specialized type of loan used in maritime trade, common in ancient Greece and Rome. Here's how it worked. A merchant wanted to finance a trading voyage but didn't have enough capital, so he'd borrow money, using the ship or cargo as collateral. But here's the interesting part. If the ship sank, if the voyage failed, the merchant didn't have to repay the loan. The lender absorbed the loss. In exchange for taking on this risk, lenders charged very high interest rates, often 50% or more for a single voyage. It sounds usurious, but it actually made economic sense. Many ships did sink. Piracy, storms, navigation errors, all sorts of things could go wrong. The high interest rate compensated lenders for the very real risk of total loss. From the merchant's perspective, it was a way to limit risk. If the voyage succeeded, yes, you paid high interest. But if it failed, you weren't ruined. You could try again. It was an early form of limited liability, of insurance, of risk sharing. Sophisticated investors would fund multiple bottomry loans, spreading their risk across many voyages. Some would fail, but the successes would more than compensate. It's portfolio theory, diversification, the same principles that guide modern investment. The bottomry loan shows that ancient peoples weren't financially naive. They understood risk and return. They understood diversification. They created instruments to facilitate commerce in ways that managed and distributed risk. The language and legal frameworks were different, but the underlying economic logic was sound. These ancient financial innovations eventually evolved into modern insurance, modern banking, modern capital markets. We think of finance as modern, but many of its core concepts are ancient, tested, and refined over thousands of years of human commerce. Now let's talk about something that connected all these ancient civilizations, something that drove trade and shaped economies from China to Rome: luxury goods. Throughout the ancient world, elites craved luxury. Exotic spices, fine textiles, precious metals, rare gems, beautiful artwork. These weren't necessities. They were status symbols, ways to display wealth and taste, to distinguish oneself from common people. This demand for luxury drove long-distance trade. The Silk Road existed because wealthy Romans wanted Chinese silk. The spice trade flourished because elites wanted pepper and cinnamon. Gold and silver flowed around the ancient world because everyone, everywhere, valued precious metals. But luxury goods created interesting economic dynamics. Because their value was primarily social, based on scarcity and exclusivity, they were prone to boom and bust cycles. When something became too common, it lost its appeal to elites. They'd move on to the next exotic import, the next rare commodity. There's a famous story about the Roman Emperor Elagabalus, who lived in the early 3rd century AD. He was known for outrageous excess, for bizarre and expensive banquets. At one dinner, he reportedly served peacock tongues. At another, he had the floor covered in rose petals so deep that some guests allegedly suffocated in them. True or not, these stories illustrate something important. Luxury consumption in the ancient world could reach absurd extremes. Fortunes were spent on elaborate displays, on status competition, on showing that you were richer, more cultured, more sophisticated than your peers. This luxury spending had economic effects. It employed craftsmen, funded trade expeditions, supported industries. But it also concentrated wealth, diverted resources from productive investment to consumption. Instead of building roads or funding education or investing in agriculture, resources went to buying rare spices or commissioning elaborate mosaics. Economists call this the positional arms race. Everyone competes to have nicer things than everyone else, but in the aggregate, this competition doesn't create value. It just redistributes resources to luxury goods producers and raises the bar for what counts as impressive. We see the same pattern in modern economies. Luxury brands, status symbols, conspicuous consumption. Human nature hasn't changed. We still want to display our success, to signal our status, and we're still willing to pay absurd prices for things whose primary value is their scarcity and the envy they inspire. Let me tell you about the economics of ancient warfare. Because war, for all its destruction, was also an economic activity, with costs and benefits, investments and returns. Ancient empires waged war for many reasons: territory, security, honor, revenge. But often, beneath the official justifications, economics played a crucial role. Wars could be profitable, at least for the winners. Rome, for example, financed much of its expansion through conquest. When a territory was conquered, there was loot to be taken: gold, silver, artwork, anything valuable. There were captives to be enslaved and sold. There was land to be distributed to soldiers or sold to speculators, and there were ongoing revenues, tribute and taxes extracted from conquered peoples. For several centuries, Roman expansion more than paid for itself. The costs of maintaining armies and waging campaigns were offset by the wealth extracted from conquest. It was, in a sense, a profitable business model. But this created a perverse incentive. Rome became addicted to expansion, to conquest, to the influx of wealth from subjugated peoples. When expansion slowed, when there were no more easy conquests, the economic model started to break down. The empire still had the expenses, armies and bureaucracy and infrastructure, but without the continual influx of conquest wealth, these expenses became burdensome. Some historians argue this was a fundamental factor in Rome's decline. The empire ran out of places to conquer, so the economic engine that had driven its rise sputtered and stalled. Other ancient powers faced similar dynamics. The Assyrian Empire was notorious for its brutality, for campaigns of terror and destruction. But there was an economic logic to it. The Assyrians would devastate regions that resisted, then exact enormous tribute from neighbours who decided submission was preferable to annihilation. It was an empire built on fear and extortion, economically sustained by tribute extracted through the threat of violence. The Mongols perfected this model centuries later. Their armies were incredibly effective military machines, but they were also profit-seeking enterprises. Cities that surrendered quickly were spared and taxed lightly. Cities that resisted were utterly destroyed, their populations massacred as a warning to others. The economic calculation was clear: surrender was cheaper than resistance. This is the dark side of ancient economics. Violence and economic extraction often went hand in hand. Power came from the ability to take wealth from others, through trade if possible, through conquest if necessary. Modern economics likes to pretend that markets are peaceful, that trade is mutually beneficial, that wealth is created through voluntary exchange. And that's true to an extent. But throughout most of history, including ancient history, coercion and violence were fundamental parts of the economic system. Empires were built on conquest. Fortunes were made through slavery. Trade routes were secured by military force. We've made progress, certainly. The global order since World War II has been more peaceful, more based on trade and mutual benefit than on conquest and tribute. But the old patterns haven't entirely disappeared. They're still there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to re-emerge when conditions allow. Let's talk now about an economic collapse that's both mysterious and instructive. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BC. For centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean had been home to sophisticated civilizations: the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the city-states of the Levant. They traded with each other, fought occasionally, but mostly coexisted in a complex interconnected system. And then, over the span of a few decades, it all fell apart. Cities were destroyed, palaces burned, trade networks collapsed, writing disappeared in some regions, populations crashed. It was a civilizational catastrophe, one of the greatest in human history. What caused it? Scholars still debate. There's evidence of invasions, the so-called sea peoples who appeared from somewhere, destroyed cities, and then vanished. There's evidence of drought and famine. There's evidence of internal revolts, of political instability. Probably it was a combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of catastrophes that overwhelmed civilization simultaneously. But here's what's relevant for our purposes. The Bronze Age collapse shows how interconnected economic systems can be vulnerable to cascading failures. These ancient civilizations depended on each other. They traded tin and copper, necessary for making bronze. They traded grain to feed their populations. They traded luxury goods to support their elites. When one system failed, it stressed the others. When trade routes were disrupted, tin stopped flowing. Bronze couldn't be made, armies couldn't be equipped. When grain shipments failed, cities starved, revolts erupted, governments fell. Each failure made the next failure more likely, creating a cascade that brought down the entire system. It took centuries for the region to fully recover. The period after the Bronze Age collapse is called the Greek Dark Ages, a time when literacy was lost, populations declined, and civilization, in many ways, regressed. But recovery did come. New civilizations emerged. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, eventually the Romans. New technologies replaced bronze. Iron became the dominant metal, more abundant and easier to work. New forms of organization emerged, city-states and leagues rather than kingdoms and empires. The collapse, as catastrophic as it was, cleared away old systems and allowed new ones to develop. Creative destruction on a civilizational scale. There's a lesson here for modern times. Our global economy is even more interconnected than the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Supply chains span the globe. Financial systems link every continent. A disruption in one place can cascade unpredictably to others. We saw hints of this during the 2008 financial crisis. A problem in American housing markets spread to European banks, to Asian manufacturers, to everyone everywhere. We're seeing it again with supply chain disruptions, with trade wars, with pandemic responses. Interconnection brings benefits, efficiency, specialization, wealth creation, but it also brings vulnerability. The more connected we are, the faster problems spread. There's no easy answer to this. We can't and shouldn't retreat to isolation. But we should be aware of the risks, should build resilience into our systems, should have backup plans for when the inevitable disruptions occur. Now let's drift to ancient China again and talk about one of the most interesting economic experiments in history, the state monopolies of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty, ruling China from roughly 200 BC to 200 AD, faced a common problem. They needed revenue to fund the government, to maintain armies, to build infrastructure. But they didn't want to raise taxes too high, which would anger the population and risk rebellion. So they developed another approach: state monopolies on key goods. Salt and iron primarily, but also alcohol in some periods. The government took over production and distribution of these goods, setting prices and pocketing the profits. On one level, it was brilliant. Salt and iron were essential. Everyone needed salt for preserving food and for basic nutrition. Farmers needed iron for tools. The demand was inelastic, meaning people would buy these goods regardless of price, so the government could charge high prices and generate enormous revenue without raising taxes. But there were problems. State-run industries tend to be less efficient than private ones. Quality suffered, innovation stagnated, and the monopolies created corruption, with officials skimming profits or demanding bribes. There were famous debates in Han China about the state monopolies. Should the government be involved in commerce, or should it stick to governance and allow private enterprise? These debates, recorded in texts that still survive, show that the Han Chinese understood the trade-offs involved. Eventually, the monopolies were partially relaxed, though the government maintained significant control over these strategic industries. It was a compromise, an attempt to balance revenue needs with economic efficiency. The lesson here is about government involvement in the economy. Too little, and you get market failures, exploitation, instability. Too much, and you get inefficiency, corruption, stagnation. Every society has to find its own balance, and that balance shifts depending on circumstances. Modern China, interestingly, faces similar debates. How much should the state control? How much should be left to markets? The answers keep changing as the government experiments with different approaches, trying to capture the benefits of both state control and market efficiency. It's a question without a permanent answer, because economies evolve, circumstances change, and what works in one era or one context might not work in another. Flexibility, adaptability, willingness to experiment and adjust. These are perhaps more important than any specific policy. Let me tell you about another fascinating aspect of ancient economics: gift economies. In modern market economies, most transactions are impersonal exchanges. I give you money, you give me goods or services, we're even, and we go our separate ways. But in many ancient societies, particularly smaller, more tribal ones, economics worked differently. Gift-giving, reciprocity, obligations between people, these were the main mechanisms of distribution. The classic example is the potlatch, practiced by indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Chiefs would hold elaborate ceremonies where they'd give away enormous amounts of wealth, food, blankets, carved items, everything. The point wasn't to maximize personal wealth, it was to demonstrate status, to create obligations in others, to build social capital. In modern economic terms, it seems irrational. Why give away your wealth? But in the context of those societies, it made perfect sense. The gift created an obligation. The recipient would be expected to reciprocate, often with interest. The chief who gave the biggest potlatch gained prestige and influence. Social capital translated to real power. Gift economies existed in the ancient Mediterranean too, though they were less elaborate than the potlatch. Wealthy Romans would distribute gifts to their clients, support them financially, help them with legal problems. In return, clients would support their patron, vote for him, show up when he needed a crowd, defend his honor. It wasn't a market transaction. There was no explicit price, no contract. But there were expectations, obligations. The gift created a relationship, a social bond that could be called upon when needed. Even in our modern market economy, gift exchanges persist. Holiday gifts, wedding presents, buying rounds of drinks, taking turns paying for dinner. These aren't market transactions, they're social ones, creating and reinforcing relationships. Understanding this helps us see ancient economies more clearly. They weren't just primitive versions of modern markets. They were different systems, with different logic, different values, different ways of organizing economic life. And arguably, those gift economies had advantages. They created social cohesion, mutual support, community. Modern market economies are efficient at producing wealth, but they can be atomizing, isolating. When everything is a transaction, when every relationship is monetized, we lose something important. Some economists argue we need to find ways to reincorporate gift economy principles into modern life. Universal basic income, for example, could be seen as a gift from society to its members, creating obligations of citizenship and participation. Community-supported agriculture brings back direct relationships between farmers and consumers. The point is, ancient economic systems weren't just wrong, and we're right. They were different, optimized for different circumstances, with their own strengths and weaknesses. We can learn from them, even as we recognize that we can't and shouldn't simply recreate them. Let's talk about one more ancient economic bubble before we start wrapping up. The Athenian silver bubble we mentioned earlier, but in more detail. In the late 6th century BC, Athens discovered incredibly rich silver veins at Laurion. Previously a minor city-state, Athens suddenly had access to enormous wealth. The city minted thousands of coins, the famous Athenian owls showing the goddess Athena and her sacred bird. With this wealth, Athens built a navy. Not just a few ships, but hundreds of triremes, the most advanced warships of the era. This navy defeated the Persian invasion, making Athens the savior of Greece. It secured trade routes, making Athens rich through commerce. It enabled Athens to build an empire extracting tribute from allied city-states. For decades, everything seemed to be going Athens' way. Wealth poured in. The city built the Parthenon, funded playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides, supported philosophers like Socrates. It was a golden age, made possible by silver from Laurion. But Athens became overconfident. The city got involved in costly wars like the Sicilian expedition, a catastrophic military failure that killed thousands of Athenians and destroyed a large fleet. The economy was strained by continuous warfare, and gradually the silver veins at Laurion were depleted. Without the steady flow of silver, without the naval supremacy it funded, Athens declined. The city lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. The empire dissolved, tribute stopped flowing, the economy contracted. Athens survived, of course. The city remained culturally important for centuries. But the peak, the moment when Athens seemed to be the center of the world, that was directly tied to silver from Laurion. When the silver ran out, so did the glory. It's another example of the resource curse, of building your economy on something finite and depletable. And it's another example of how wealth can breed overconfidence, leading to bad decisions and eventual decline. But here's the interesting part. The cultural legacy of Athens, the philosophy, the drama, the art, the ideas, those survived long after the economic power faded. The Parthenon still stands. We still read Sophocles and Plato. The ideas developed during Athens' golden age shaped Western civilization. So maybe the economic bubble, as destructive as its collapse was, created conditions for cultural flowering that had lasting value beyond the temporary wealth. Maybe bubbles, for all their problems, sometimes fund things that outlast them. It's a more optimistic take than the purely negative view of bubbles. Yes, they're irrational. Yes, they cause suffering when they pop. But sometimes, the wealth generated during the bubble phase gets invested in things of lasting value. Universities founded during boom times, art commissioned by newly wealthy patrons, infrastructure built with bubble money. Not all bubble wealth is wasted on consumption and speculation. Some of it creates genuine value that persists after the bubble bursts. Now let's bring all of this home. Let's talk about you, about us, about the modern world we inhabit and how these ancient lessons apply. You're lying there, listening to this, probably wondering if any of this matters. Ancient Romans and Chinese dynasties and Phoenician traders, what do they have to do with your 401k or your mortgage or your student loans? Everything, actually. The mechanisms might be more complex now. We have stock markets and derivatives and high-frequency trading and cryptocurrency and all sorts of financial instruments that would baffle ancient merchants. We have central banks and monetary policy and global interconnected finance that operates at speeds and scales unimaginable to ancient peoples. But underneath all that complexity, the same codes are still running. The same human psychology is still at work. The same patterns are still repeating. When we see a stock that's been climbing steadily, we feel the pull of recency bias. We assume the trend will continue. We forget that all trends eventually reverse, that what goes up must come down, that trees don't grow to the sky. The Romans who bought land during the Pax Romana felt the same way. So did the Song Dynasty citizens who trusted paper money. So did the Athenians who thought their silver would last forever. When we hear that everyone's investing in cryptocurrency or real estate or tech stocks or whatever the hot asset is this year, we feel the pull of herd behavior. We don't want to miss out. We don't want to be the fool who sat on the sidelines while everyone else got rich. But remember, by the time everyone is doing something, it's often too late. The bubble is already at its peak, ready to burst. The smart money has already moved on. When we think we've figured out the market, that we're smarter than everyone else, that we've found a system or strategy that can't fail, that's overconfidence talking. It's hubris. And the ancient Greeks could tell you what happens to hubris. Nemesis follows. The gods punish those who think they're cleverer than fate. And debt. Oh, debt is everywhere in modern life. Student loans that burden young people for decades. Credit cards with interest rates that would have shocked ancient Roman usurers, mortgages that turn homes into decades-long financial commitments, car loans, personal loans, payday loans. We live in a leveraged society where debt is normalized, where it's seen as the only way to get an education, buy a home, start a business, sometimes even to survive. For most people in developed countries, debt is unavoidable. The question isn't whether to take on debt, but how much and for what purpose. And that's where the ancient lessons become critical. The Mesopotamians, 4,000 years ago, understood that debt could become unsustainable, that it needed to be managed, sometimes forgiven. The Romans learned, painfully, that excessive leverage amplifies both gains and losses. The Song Chinese discovered that debt, denominated in inflating currency, becomes worthless. These aren't abstract historical curiosities. They're patterns that repeat, codes that run through all of economic history, including our present and future. So what do? How do we use these ancient lessons in our modern lives? First, we cultivate awareness. We recognize that we're not special, that we're not immune to the psychological biases that have trapped humans for millennia. When you feel absolutely certain about an investment, pause. Ask yourself what you might be missing. When you see everyone rushing towards something, consider stepping back. When you feel tempted to borrow heavily for something that won't generate returns, remember the Romans and their land speculation, the Song Dynasty and their currency crisis. Second, we respect the power of debt. Borrow when it makes sense, when the investment is solid and the terms are manageable. Education can be good debt if it increases your earning potential. A home can be good debt if you can afford the payments and plan to stay long enough to benefit. A business loan can be good debt if the business is sound and the projections are realistic. But never forget that debt is a promise to your future self, and your future self might be in a very different situation than you expect. Jobs are lost, health fails, markets crash, interest rates rise, circumstances change, and when they do, debt that seemed manageable can become crushing. The ancient Mesopotamians had jubilees, debt forgiveness. We have bankruptcy, which serves a similar function. But bankruptcy is painful, destructive to credit and reputation. Better to avoid taking on debt you might not be able to repay than to rely on bankruptcy as a safety net. Third, we diversify. The ancient Romans who lost everything had put all their wealth in land. The Song Dynasty citizens who suffered through hyperinflation held only paper money. The Athenians who depended entirely on silver from Lorient were devastated when the mines played out. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Hold different types of assets, some cash for liquidity, some real estate for stability, some stocks for growth, some bonds for safety, some precious metals as insurance against currency problems. The specific allocations depend on your situation, your goals, your risk tolerance. But the principle of diversification is universal and ancient. Fourth, we stay humble. The forgotten financial codes teach us that no boom lasts forever, that every bubble eventually pops, that confidence is often a prelude to disaster. The Phoenicians knew this. They spread their risk across multiple trading voyages. The wise Romans of the late Republic understood that fortunes could reverse with shocking speed. Stay humble, stay curious, stay ready to adapt. Assume that you'll be wrong sometimes, that markets will surprise you, that unexpected things will happen. Build buffers into your life. Keep emergency funds. Don't live right at the edge of your means. Give yourself room to survive mistakes and bad luck. And fifth, remember the bigger picture. Economics isn't everything. The Athenians lost their silver mines, but they created philosophy and drama that lasted thousands of years. The Romans fell, but they left us law and literature and engineering. The Song Dynasty was conquered, but Chinese culture survived and flourished. Money matters, financial security matters, but relationships, experiences, creativity, learning, these matter too. Sometimes more. Don't sacrifice everything else in pursuit of wealth, because when the bubble pops, when the crash comes, and it will come eventually, the things that endure are usually not financial. Your skills, your relationships, your knowledge, your character. These are assets that can't be devalued by inflation or wiped out by a market crash. Invest in them alongside your financial investments. Let me tell you one last ancient story before we finish for the night. It's about Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor of Rome. Marcus Aurelius ruled during difficult times, plagues, wars, economic troubles, all sorts of crises. He had access to the wealth of an empire, to luxuries beyond imagining. But he was also a Stoic philosopher, someone who believed that external circumstances, including wealth, were less important than the internal character. In his personal writings, the Meditations, which were never meant for publication, Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly not to be seduced by wealth and power. He wrote about the impermanence of all things, about how emperors and beggars end up in the same place, dust and oblivion. He tried to cultivate gratitude for what he had while not becoming attached to it. It's a perspective that feels very relevant to our discussion. Yes, learn about economics. Yes, be prudent with money. Yes, try to build financial security. But don't let money dominate your life. Don't let the pursuit of wealth consume you. Don't measure your worth by your net worth. The richest man in the graveyard, as the saying goes, is still dead. The ancient world understood this, perhaps better than we do. They saw fortunes made and lost. They saw empires rise and fall. They saw that nothing lasts forever, that all wealth is temporary, that you can't take it with you. And yet, they still engaged with economics, still worked and traded and saved and invested. Because you have to live, you have to eat, you have to provide for those who depend on you. The goal isn't to renounce wealth entirely. It's to keep it in perspective, to see it as a tool rather than an end in itself. The forgotten financial codes teach us practical lessons about debt and leverage and diversification. But they also teach us philosophical lessons about impermanence and perspective and what really matters. And maybe, as you drift off to sleep tonight, that's the lesson to carry with you. That money matters, but it's not everything. That the patterns repeat, but you can learn from them. That human nature hasn't changed, but awareness of our biases can help us make better choices. That empires fall and bubbles burst, but life goes on, and there's always the possibility of renewal and recovery. You know, there's something profound about studying ancient economics as you fall asleep. You're bridging time in a way, connecting with people who lived thousands of years ago, but faced remarkably similar challenges. The merchant in ancient Carthage worried about a risky trading voyage. The farmer in Mesopotamia, hoping the harvest would be good enough to repay his debts. The Roman landlord, watching nervously as property values started to fall. They were just like us. They wanted security, prosperity, a better future for their children. They felt the same anxieties about money, the same hopes that their investments would pay off, the same fears that everything might fall apart. And in a sense, they're speaking to us across the millennia, through clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, through coins and ruins, through the patterns that keep repeating. They're telling us what they learned, what worked, what failed, what led to prosperity, and what led to ruin. We should listen to them, not because ancient wisdom is automatically superior to modern knowledge. It's not. We understand economics better now than the Romans or Greeks or Chinese ever did. We have better data, better theories, better tools, but they had something we often lack: perspective. They could see entire economic cycles play out within lifetimes. They watched bubbles inflate and pop. They experienced crises and recoveries. And the wisest among them recognized the patterns, understood that human nature doesn't change, that the same mistakes get made over and over. That's what the forgotten financial codes really are. They're not secret formulas or hidden strategies. They're patterns of human behavior, repeated across cultures and centuries. Greed and fear, confidence and panic, boom and bust. These cycles are as predictable as seasons, as natural as tides. And once you see the patterns, once you understand the codes, you can't unsee them. You start recognizing them everywhere. In news stories about the latest market craze, in your own impulses to follow the crowd or believe that this time is different, in the recurring arguments about debt and inflation and monetary policy. The codes are still running. They've been running for thousands of years, and they'll keep running long after we're gone. But understanding them, even a little, gives you an advantage. Not a guarantee of wealth, there are no guarantees, but awareness, perspective, a better chance of avoiding the worst mistakes and surviving the inevitable crashes. As you settle deeper now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, let yourself feel connected to that long chain of human economic experience. You're part of a story that stretches back to the first person who ever traded one thing for another, who ever lent something expecting to be repaid, who ever saved for the future or borrowed against it. The Roman merchant is your ancestor in a way. Not genetically necessarily, but spiritually, economically. You face the same fundamental challenges: how to survive, how to thrive, how to balance risk and security, how to plan for an uncertain future. And the Song Dynasty citizen who watched their currency become worthless, they're your ancestor too. Their experience echoes in every currency crisis since. The fear, the anger, the sense of betrayal when institutions fail and savings evaporate. It's a very human experience, repeated countless times. Even the Mesopotamian king who declared a debt jubilee, cancelling all debts to prevent social collapse, that's part of your inheritance. Because we're still arguing about the same things. Should student debt be forgiven? Should mortgages underwater after a crash be restructured? The specifics change, but the underlying questions remain. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To know that you're not alone, that countless humans before you have struggled with the same economic anxieties and uncertainties, and also survived, and built civilizations, and created beauty and meaning despite the constant economic pressures. Because that's the other lesson from the ancient world. Economics matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. The Greeks gave us philosophy and democracy. The Romans gave us law and engineering. The Chinese gave us paper and printing and so much else. The Phoenicians gave us the alphabet. These contributions, these legacies, they outlasted the economic systems that produced them. The empires fell, the currencies became worthless, the bubbles burst. But the ideas, the art, the technologies, those persisted. So yes, be financially prudent. Learn from the ancient codes. Avoid excessive debt. Diversify your assets. Be aware of your biases. Stay humble about your ability to predict the future. But also remember to live, to create, to love, to find meaning in things beyond money. Because when you're old, when you're looking back on your life, you probably won't be thinking about your portfolio returns. You'll be thinking about relationships, experiences, things you made or learned or did. The forgotten financial codes can help you avoid ruin, can help you build security, but they can't tell you what to do with that security, what kind of life to build, what really matters to you. That's something only you can decide, and it's okay if you don't have it all figured out. The ancient philosophers didn't either. They asked questions, explored possibilities, tried to understand, and that seeking, that exploration, it was itself valuable. So as you drift off now, wherever you are in this vast interconnected world of ours, let these ancient voices whisper you to sleep. The merchant counting coins in a moonlit courtyard, the scribe recording debts on a clay tablet, the sailor watching the horizon for storms, the farmer hoping for rain, the emperor worried about the treasury. They're all there, in the background of history, living their lives, making their choices, experiencing their own small triumphs and disasters. And they're all connected to you through time, through the eternal human story of working and trading and saving and spending. The patterns will keep repeating. Bubbles will inflate and burst. Debts will accumulate and need to be resolved. Currencies will rise and fall. Economies will boom and crash. It's the nature of things, the way human systems work. But you don't have to be a victim of these patterns. You can understand them, prepare for them, adapt to them. You can learn from the mistakes of the past, both ancient and recent. You can cultivate awareness and humility and flexibility, and you can also step back from it all sometimes. Remember that you're more than your net worth, that your value isn't measured in currency, that a good life is about more than financial optimization. The ancient world knew this. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire, still found time to think about ethics and meaning. The Buddha, born into wealth, renounced it all to seek enlightenment. Epicurus taught that simple pleasures, friendship and thought and peace, were more valuable than luxury. Different philosophical traditions, different answers. But they all recognized that money, while necessary, isn't sufficient for a good life. So find your balance. Be financially responsible, yes. But don't let that responsibility become anxiety that steals your sleep. Build your security, but don't hoard out of fear. Plan for the future, but don't forget to enjoy the present. The wheel will keep turning, seasons will change, fortunes will rise and fall, and through it all life will continue, with its mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, abundance and scarcity. The forgotten financial codes remind us that we've been here before, that our ancestors navigated the same turbulent economic waters, that humans are resilient and adaptable and capable of weathering storms. So sleep well tonight, knowing you're part of that long story, that ancient lineage of humans trying to figure out how to live in an uncertain world. The markets will still be there tomorrow, following the same old patterns, driven by the same old impulses, but tonight you can let it all go. You can rest, secure in the knowledge that the patterns are knowable, that the codes can be learned, that awareness is power, and that humans have survived economic upheaval for thousands of years and will continue to do so. You know what's really beautiful about all of this? It's that economics, for all its numbers and charts and abstract theories, is ultimately about humans, about our hopes and fears, our cleverness and foolishness, our cooperation and competition, every transaction, every market, every bubble and crash. It's all human behavior playing out in patterns. And those patterns connect us across time and space to every other human who's ever worried about having enough, who's ever hoped for prosperity, who's ever tried to build something secure. The Roman who lost everything in the financial panic of 33 AD, they felt the same knot in their stomach that someone felt in 2008 when their retirement account evaporated. The Song Dynasty citizen watching prices double and double again, they felt the same helplessness that people feel during hyperinflation today. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're human experiences, emotional realities that transcend time and culture. Fear feels the same whether you're worried about losing your villa in Rome or your house in Ohio. Hope feels the same whether you're excited about a spice trading opportunity or a tech startup. Understanding this, really feeling it, it creates a kind of compassion, not just for ancient peoples, but for everyone caught in economic systems larger than themselves. The person who lost money in the crypto crash isn't stupid. They're human, susceptible to the same biases that have trapped humans forever. The family struggling with debt isn't irresponsible. They're caught in systems and circumstances that have been challenging for as long as there's been debt. We're all doing our best. We're all navigating complexity with limited information and flawed psychology. We're all inheritors of thousands of years of economic patterns, for better and worse. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson from the forgotten financial codes. Not specific financial advice, though there's some of that, but perspective, humility, compassion for ourselves and others as we all stumble through economic reality, making mistakes, learning slowly, hoping for the best. The ancient world forgives you your financial mistakes. They made them too, all of them. Every mistake you could make, someone in ancient Rome or Babylon or Chang'an made it first. And life went on, civilization survived, humans persisted. So be kind to yourself. Do your best to make wise choices. Learn from the patterns, but don't beat yourself up when things don't go perfectly. You're part of a very long tradition of humans trying to figure this out, and nobody's ever gotten it completely right. The last thing I want to leave you with as you drift into sleep is a sense of continuity. The ancient world isn't really gone. It's still here, in us, in our institutions, in our patterns of behavior. When you use money, you're participating in a system that would be recognizable to ancient Lydians who invented coinage. When you borrow or lend, you're part of a credit system that extends back to Mesopotamian clay tablets. When you worry about inflation or recession, you're experiencing concerns that troubled Roman emperors and Chinese dynasties. The surface changes, the technology advances, but the deep structures, the codes, they persist. And in a strange way, this gives meaning to economic life. You're not just trying to pay your bills and save for retirement. You're participating in something ancient and ongoing, something that connects you to billions of humans across thousands of years. The Phoenician trader loading his ship with purple dye, he was doing his part to keep commerce flowing, to connect civilizations, to build networks of exchange that made culture and prosperity possible. And you, going to work, paying your bills, making your investments, you're doing the same thing, playing your small part in the vast eternal project of human economic life. It's not meaningless or mechanical. It's deeply human, deeply historical, deeply connected to everything that came before and everything that will come after. The forgotten financial codes aren't really forgotten. They're still here, still running, still shaping our lives. We've just lost awareness of them, lost the long perspective that comes from studying history. But now you know. You've heard the whispers from the ancient world. You've learned the patterns. You've decoded some of the codes. And that knowledge, that perspective, it's yours to keep, to use, to pass on to others if you choose. The wheel keeps turning, the patterns keep repeating. But each of us, with awareness and intention, can navigate them a little better, can avoid some of the worst pitfalls, can build lives of greater security and meaning. That's not a small thing. That's not nothing. That's the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human economic experience, distilled and offered to you as you sleep. So take it. Let it settle into your unconscious mind. Let it inform your choices subtly, without anxiety or stress. Just awareness, perspective, a longer view of things. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever and whenever you are. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of something ancient and ongoing. Sleep well, knowing that the patterns are knowable, that the codes can be learned, that humans have always figured out ways to survive and sometimes even thrive. The quantum world will still be here when you wake. The markets will still be operating, following their ancient patterns. The wheel will still be turning. But for now, you can rest. You can let it all go. You can trust that tomorrow you'll wake refreshed, perhaps with a slightly different perspective, a bit more wisdom about the eternal dance of economics and human nature. From the sleepy scientist, good night. May your dreams be filled with ancient marketplaces and wise merchants, with perspectives that span millennia, with the comfort of knowing that you're part of a very long story, and that story continues. The forgotten financial codes are forgotten no longer. They're with you now. Use them wisely. Use them well. Use them with humility and compassion for yourself and others. And most of all, sleep tight. Rest easy. The ancient world, in all its economic turmoil and triumph, has given you its lessons. Now it's time to let your unconscious mind process them while you sleep. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May the wisdom of ages settle gently into your mind like dust from ancient civilizations, coating everything with a fine layer of perspective and peace. From somewhere in time, from the eternal present that connects all economic experience across millennia, good night. And thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten financial codes of the ancient world. Sleep now. Dream of empires and markets, of bubbles and crashes, of resilience and renewal, and wake tomorrow ready to write your own chapter in the endless story of human economic life. Good night.